John, about 7 years ago, you told me free will was one of the biggest scandals in philosophy. Scandal getting any better?
No, it's getting more scandalous, I think. And the scandal is, after all these centuries of worrying about it and all these very intelligent people writing and thinking and debating about it, it doesn't seem to me we've made any progress. On other subjects like consciousness and morality and political rights, it seems to me we have made some progress. But where free will is concerned, we're pretty much back where we was when I started doing philosophy a long time ago. And I have to say, maybe even generations before that.
Okay, well, let's discern why. I mean, if we've made progress in some other areas and not in free will, I mean, one conclusion may be that it's not a real problem. It's a problem of definitions, or people are screwing things up in a linguistic sense, and it's unsolvable.
Yeah, well, let me tell you why it is such a problem. We can give pretty good arguments for saying we don't have free will. We're just part of nature like anything else. We no more have free will than a plant has free will. The problem is that we all have experiences, conscious experiences of making up our minds, of deciding something, where we experience a kind of causal gap. I have reasons for voting for a particular candidate in an election, reasons to vote against voting for that candidate, but all the same, at the end of the day, I have to make up my mind. Now, here's the amazing fact about that experience. That experience only makes sense to me if I assume that I really have a choice. That is the experience, this I call the gap. There's a causal gap between the reasons and the decision. And the experience of the gap is what gives us the conviction that we have free will. And we can't. Now, what is peculiar about this, you cannot evade that conviction. You see, if I come and think that free will is an illusion, all the same, I still have to make up my mind. If I think colors are an illusion, I can live my life on the assumption that colors are an illusion. But if I come to think that free will is an illusion, it's no good. I still have to exercise my free will. See, if I go in a restaurant and I order something and the waiter says, well, what are you going to have? It's no good saying, waiter, I'm a determinist. Everything is determined. I'll just wait and see what happens. Che sarà, sarà, it's an Italian restaurant. But that won't do, because the refusal to exercise free will only makes sense to me if I construe it as an exercise of free will. So here's the puzzle. We have good arguments thinking we don't have free will, yet we have to live our lives on the assumption that we do, and we don't see any way to reconcile these two.
But living your life as if you do is not saying the same thing as that you really do. Maybe it is an illusion.
It could be an illusion.
You're using very careful words. The experience of it, the sense of it, the feeling of it. That could be an illusion.
Yeah. The fact that I experience the gap does not prove the reality of free will. No question. But it does make free will different from other problems.
Okay.
In that, in other problems, if you become convinced that something is an illusion, rainbows are an illusion, okay, it's an illusion. There isn't really an arch in the sky. But if I become convinced that free will is an illusion, then I'm still stuck with the fact that I have to act on the presupposition of free will. I gave a lecture on this in London. A guy in the audience said, well, suppose free will was refuted. Suppose determinism was proved to be true.
Right.
Would you accept that result?
Yeah.
And I said, what you're asking me is, suppose it was proved there's no such thing as free rational decision making. Would you freely and rationally decide to accept that result? That's the paradox. I can give you arguments for saying that we have no free will, and yet we have to proceed on the assumption as if we had free will. All of our rationality, all of it, presupposes free will. Kant made this very point, that you can't get out of the conviction of free will.
I want to take you to both extremes, because I like exploring extremes to understand. So on the one extreme, let's assume there is absolute real free will.
Yeah.
How, in principle, could that be caused?
Okay. Yes. No, that is the next step. Suppose, let's examine each thing. What would the world be like if determinism were true?
Right.
What would it be like if free will were true?
Right.
Okay. If that were the case, then there will be events in the universe, namely free decisions, which sometimes do not have antecedently sufficient causes. They don't have causes sufficient to fix that particular event.
Powerful.
How is that possible? Yeah. Well, let's look around in the universe and figure out, are there any parts of the universe that are like that, where you do not have antecedently sufficient causes for events? And of course, there is such a part. It's the quantum part. Quantum mechanics is not deterministic, and it's odd to describe that as a part, because of course everything is quantum mechanical all the way up, from the quarks and the muons up to the larger bodies. But here's the puzzle then. If free will is a reality, and the only parts of the universe we know for a fact that lack causally sufficient conditions for the sequence of events that occurs, then there must be some connection between free will and quantum mechanics. How could that be? Well, one of the more, less likely explanations of consciousness is the quantum mechanical explanation, is that consciousness is essentially a quantum mechanical phenomenon.
But let's look at the free will part of it. If quantum mechanics is non-predictable, and so if are things that are random, are those free will? I mean, which is worse, determinism or randomness?
Okay, this is a standard objection. It's one I used to accept against the quantum mechanical explanation of free will, and that is quantum indeterminacy is randomness, and free decision-making is not random.
Right.
Okay, now formally speaking, that commits a fallacy, that argument of the fallacy of composition, of supposing features of the little things must be features of the big things that the consciousness is made of. But to avoid that, you'd have to say something that doesn't sound very plausible. You'd have to say the quantum indeterminacy, which is random at the submolecular level, gives rise to, through causal processes in producing consciousness, gives rise to a consciousness that inherits the indeterminacy of the quantum level without inheriting the randomness.
Oh, wow.
Now, if that isn't enough to keep a philosopher awake at nights, I don't know what is, but that's the best I can come up with. It is formally possible.
At least in principle, I like that. I mean, I'm sure I don't agree with it, but I like the idea that there, at least in principle, there is something that can achieve that. The other problem with quantum mechanics is that you have it all over, and you have to have this problem of composition, that you're adding all these little bits together and somehow,
the big one.
You get a big one.
Okay, so now here's what you'd have to have. I mean, if we're going to prove, given what we know about physics today, if you're going to prove the existence of free will, you'd have to have the following. There has to be a quantum mechanical explanation of consciousness. The quantum mechanical explanation of consciousness has to show how consciousness inherits the absence of determinacy of the quantum level without inheriting the randomness of the quantum level. And you'd have to show how all of the quantum phenomena add up to a single, integrated, unified sense of consciousness, including the consciousness of free will.
Right.
So you asked me a question about the mystery of free will. I gave you three mysteries in answer.
All right, now I got to take you to the other extreme. And these are the hard determinists. The world is fully determined. There's no indeterminacy. And is there free will? And there's a big dispute in that group. They fully believe in determinism. Some people say, therefore, logically, there's no free will. You got to accept no free will, and whatever the moral implications of that, so be it. There's no free will. Others come up with so-called compatibilism, that we can say the world is fully determined, but define free will in a way that enables you to survive free will within a determined world.
Okay, I'll be brief about compatibilism. It seems to me a cop-out. The compatibilist says, well, sure, everything's determined. It's just, let's continue to use the vocabulary of free will. We'll continue to make a distinction.
Because nobody's constraining me. I'm not in a straitjacket.
Right. There are some kinds of determined actions where they're determined by causes inside my brain.
Right.
And we'll call those free.
Right.
And that, as far as ordinary language usage is concerned, that's probably okay. That is, we say, I did it of my own free will, where, of course, it may be completely determined. So as far as ordinary language is concerned, compatibilism is right about ordinary use of these words. But if we're talking about with heavy-duty philosophy, and you want to know what the philosophical conclusion are, compatibilism doesn't answer the question. because the question is not, is there a use of the words where freedom and determinism are compatible? The question is, are there human actions which are such that the causes of the action were not sufficient to fix that action? And that's the hard question. So that's compatibilism is just an evasion. But I think, I mean, we could go on about this, but they're still around, and it does appeal to a lot of people to think, well, we can still talk the vocabulary of free will, even if we have to grant that really it's a form of determinism, that free will is compatible with determinism on this use of the words. But the more interesting is, what is the world like if determinism is true? And there it seems to me it's pretty much what we were brought up to believe it's like before quantum mechanics. Everything is completely predictable on the basis of causally determinate conditions. It's all predictable according to the laws of nature. And indeed, it would be easy enough to build a robot. I mean, technically, easy. It's got all sorts of mechanical problems involved. But it would be easy to build a robot that had no free will. It might say, I have free will, and it might argue that it has free will, but we know that it has no free will because we programmed it to behave according to a computer program. So the world describable without free will is easier to describe than the world with free will. The problem is we can't believe it.